Thank you for joining us for this 10-minute talk, the second in our series on trauma-informed legal representation. I'm Kelsey Murrell. I'm an associate here at CM Murray, and I'm joined by the brilliant Anjali Bonner Hughes, who's a psychotherapist experienced in working with people who have experienced trauma. Before retraining as a psychotherapist, Anjali worked as a corporate lawyer in New York for many years, so she's particularly well-placed to talk about the intersection of law and trauma. Thank you for joining us today, Anjali.
Thank you, Kelsey. Good to be with you.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what trauma actually is and how it affects the brain?
So trauma really is any harm that kind of is too big for us to cope with using our normal coping mechanisms. So trauma is very individual. What's traumatic for one person might not be traumatic for another person, but trauma often takes the form of sort of chronic, prolonged abuse. I would say that's the most common form of trauma in our society, childhood abuse. So it can be chronic trauma over many years, or it could be one single traumatic event, like an assault or an attack of some kind. Or it could be an event that's just so outside of our norm, for example, a soldier going to war, that it really just overpowers our typical coping mechanisms. And trauma really does have an effect on various parts of the brain. And I think before I explain how it affects the brain, it's important to understand sort of what the three main systems of the brain are. The first one is the brain stem. So that's really the home of all of our kind of pre-conscious, involuntary physiology. For example, our heartbeat, breathing, balance, and coordination, all of that is housed in the brainstem. Then the second main system would be our limbic system, which is really sort of where our emotions and behaviors are regulated. Now, the limbic system is a really key system to think about when thinking about trauma. Trauma affects two main components of the limbic system. The first one being the amygdala and the second one being the hippocampus. So the amygdala is sort of our smoke detector, the brain's smoke detector. That's really our threat response system. So for example, if you are trying to cross a busy road, you take a step out into the road, you notice out of the corner of your eye a bus coming towards you, you instinctively take a step back before your thinking brain even has a chance to register the threat and kind of devise a plan of action. Your amygdala has hopped on board, detected the threat, and instinctively you took a step back away from the threat. So the amygdala is quite famously the home of our fight or flight system. And another key component of the limbic system is the hippocampus, also very much affected by trauma. The hippocampus is really the place where we store episodic memory, where we encode short-term memory into long-term memory, and also where we make meaning of our memory. And then the third key system of the brain, and another key area affected by trauma, is the prefrontal cortex. So this is sometimes called the brain's watchtower. It's where all of our executive functions are. So thinking, reasoning, anything to do with logic, making plans, executing on our plans, metacognition, so thinking about thinking, all of that is done in the cortex. It's sort of what divides us from the rest of the animal kingdom, our very large prefrontal cortex and our ability to think, to self-reflect, to plan ahead. And the way the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex are affected by trauma is that if you actually look at brain scans of people who have PTSD, and by the way, PTSD is much more common than is known. About 8 or 9% of Americans are known to suffer from it or have suffered from it. So it's out there, it's prevalent. And brain scans of people with PTSD show a markedly decreased volume in both the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So that is a decrease in the volume of the part of your brain where you're thinking, where you're able to connect cause and result, action and consequence, that's your prefrontal cortex, and again, your hippocampus, which is where you're really encoding memory and making meaning of memory. So that decrease in the volume of the prefrontal cortex means you're going to have trouble making plans. You're going to have trouble understanding that your behaviors might be risky because, again, you're sort of not able to understand sometimes the connection between actions and consequences. If you're having diminished activity in your prefrontal cortex, that might also lead to mood swings. It can lead to addictive behavior. It can lead to just general impulsivity. And if we think about the impact of trauma on the hippocampus, again, a marked decrease in the volume of the hippocampus. That often leads to trauma victims having a lot of trouble with recall, with both the contextual and the time sequence of their traumatic event. So it's very common for trauma victims to very vividly remember snatches or parts of the event. For example, you might remember the cologne of the person who hurt you, or you might remember the color of their eyes, but you might not remember what the room looked like. You might not remember what you were wearing or who you were with. Because the hippocampus has been harmed, it's having trouble recalling the event in a way that is sequential and that makes a lot of sense to you or to somebody that you might be trying to explain it to. And again, harm to the hippocampus also means difficulty creating new memories. So that's sort of an ongoing problem, not just with recall of memories, but also with creating new memories. And then lastly, the other key area that is affected in the brain by trauma is the amygdala. So again, that's our fight or flight response, our threat detection system. So the amygdala very often in trauma victims goes into overdrive. So they become hypervigilant and hypersensitive to perceived threats or triggers. So, for example, the soldier who maybe dealt with gunshots or bombs going off in the place of a war, when he's coming back home or she is coming back home, if they hear fireworks or hear a car tire backfiring, that loud noise might trigger sort of that bodily memory of their traumatic experiences out at the war or a battle that they were in. And although in their prefrontal cortex, they might be able to tell themselves it's only a firework, the way their body responds and the response of their amygdala, that threat detection system, it's putting them straight back in that place of their trauma. So the amygdala becomes very sensitive to perceived threat, detects danger where there might not be danger, and that can lead to an overall increase of stress hormone in the body, so cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline. And for some people suffering from chronic trauma, so for example, somebody who was abused as a child, they might develop a much higher baseline of those anxiety and sort of threat response chemicals like, again, adrenaline or cortisol, which can lead to generalized anxiety. It can lead to depression and other sort of chronic long-term mental health challenges. So trauma really does affect the brain in myriad ways, which all sort of work in a kind of feedback loop. So the cortex and the limbic system are constantly talking to each other, and having sort of difficulties in both of those systems creates difficulties in the overall functioning of the brain.
Thank you. That's a really helpful overview, and you've given some excellent examples, some of which I think will be familiar to people, and when they've thought about what trauma looks like. And thank you everyone for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this 10-minute talk. This is the second video in our 10-minute talk series on trauma-informed legal representation. Our first video, which you can find on our website, covered practical tips for legal practitioners. For more talks and many more resources, please check out our website at www.cm-murray.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey.